We live in a world that tells us to work harder, push longer, hustle faster. And yet, for all our efforts, so many people wake up tired before the day even begins. Not tired from doing too much, but tired from doing things that don't matter to them. We celebrate success, but feel unfulfilled. We accumulate power, but feel empty. We call it progress, yet something deeply human is missing. The problem is not a lack of discipline. The problem is a lack of meaning. Discipline is often framed as force, something we must impose on ourselves through pressure, fear, or external reward. But real discipline, the kind that lasts, does not come from willpower alone. It comes from belief. When people know why they do what they do, discipline stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like commitment. You don't need to be pushed to protect something you care about. You don't need motivation to show up for something you believe in. Many of our modern struggles, burnout, disengagement, anxiety, and division, are symptoms of systems built without a clear why. We have designed organizations that measure productivity but ignore purpose. We reward short-term results while quietly eroding trust. We ask people to give more of themselves while offering less meaning in return. And when people begin to feel like tools instead of contributors, they disconnect, not because they are weak, but because they are human. Fear-based leadership thrives in these systems. When leaders prioritize numbers over people, control over trust, speed over sustainability, they may get results in the short term. But fear is an unstable fuel. It exhausts people. It narrows thinking. It discourages courage. Over time, it weakens not just organizations, but societies. Because when people no longer feel safe, they stop caring. And when people stop caring, discipline disappears. Human beings are not motivated by instructions alone. We are inspired by purpose. We want to know that our work matters, that our effort contributes to something larger than ourselves. This is not idealism, it is biology. When we feel trusted, when we feel valued, when we feel part of a cause, our brains respond differently. We become more resilient, more creative, more willing to endure hardship because we understand what the hardship is for. This is why leaders matter so much. Leadership is not about being in charge. It is about taking care of those in your charge. It is a responsibility, not a rank. Great leaders do not extract value from people. They create environments where people can discover their value. They do not demand discipline. They inspire devotion. And they understand that trust is not a soft concept. Trust is a measurable strategic advantage that compounds over time. Short-term thinking has taught us to chase outcomes instead of causes. We fixate on quarterly gains, viral moments, and immediate wins while ignoring the long-term consequences of our decisions. But anything built without purpose eventually collapses under its own weight. Systems that exploit people for results may look efficient, but they are fragile. Systems that serve people may move slower at first, but they endure. Hope begins when we take responsibility. Responsibility to ask ourselves why we do what we do, not just what we do. Responsibility to challenge cultures that normalize exhaustion and call it ambition. Responsibility to redefine success not as how much we take, but how much we contribute. Meaning does not arrive from the outside. It is built, choice by choice, through service to something bigger than ourselves. When individuals reconnect with their why, they find clarity. When leaders lead with empathy and courage, they build trust. When communities align around shared purpose, they become resilient. And when work has meaning, discipline becomes natural, not forced, not performative, but intrinsic. So the call to action is simple, but not easy. Start with why. Ask it of yourself. Ask it of your organizations. Ask it of the systems you participate in and the leaders you follow. Choose long-term impact over short-term comfort. Choose people over numbers. Choose service over status. Because the future will not be shaped by those who work the hardest, but by those who work with purpose. And the leaders we need are not the ones who demand more discipline from others, but the ones who create meaning so powerful that discipline follows naturally. Discipline is often misunderstood as force. We talk about it as if it is something we must impose on ourselves through rigid routines, external rewards, or fear of consequences. We tell people to be more disciplined, to push harder, to wake up earlier, to sacrifice more. And when they fail to maintain that discipline, we label it as a character flaw. But discipline that relies on pressure is fragile. It works only as long as the pressure exists, and the moment it is removed, the behavior collapses. True discipline, the kind that lasts, does not come from being pushed. It comes from being pulled by something meaningful. When work has meaning, discipline becomes natural because the effort no longer feels like self-denial. It feels like responsibility. People do not need to be reminded to show up for things they care deeply about. Parents do not need discipline to protect their children. Communities do not need pressure to rally around a shared cause in times of crisis. In those moments, action flows effortlessly because the purpose is clear. The struggle is not in the doing, the struggle is in the absence of why. Modern systems often mistake compliance for commitment. They design incentives, penalties, and surveillance mechanisms to control behavior, assuming that discipline must be enforced. But compliance is not engagement. It produces the minimum required effort, not the best people have to offer. Over time, pressure-driven environments drain energy, creativity, and trust. People begin to associate discipline with exhaustion and resentment rather than pride and fulfillment. They do what they are told, not what they believe in. Burnout thrives in these environments because people are asked to give endlessly without understanding the significance of their contribution. When effort is disconnected from meaning, even small tasks feel heavy. The human mind needs context. It needs to know how today's work fits into something larger than today. Without that context, discipline becomes a constant battle between obligation and exhaustion. People are not lazy. They are depleted by systems that ignore their need for purpose, meaning change is how discipline is experienced. When individuals understand why their work matters, discipline transforms from an external demand into an internal standard. They hold themselves accountable not because someone is watching, but because their identity is tied to the cause. They do not ask how little they can do to get by. They ask how much they can contribute without losing integrity. This kind of discipline is quiet, consistent, and resilient because it is rooted in belief. Leadership plays a critical role in shaping this dynamic. Leaders who rely on pressure communicate, often unintentionally, that results matter more than people. They prioritize speed over sustainability and control over trust. In the short term, this may look effective. Targets are hit, metrics improve, and productivity appears high. But beneath the surface, something erodes. People stop bringing their full selves to work. Fear replaces curiosity. Discipline becomes survival rather than commitment. Purpose-driven leadership takes a different approach. It starts by clearly articulating why the organization exists beyond profit or output. It creates environments where people feel safe to care, safe to speak, and safe to fail while learning. In such environments, discipline emerges organically. People manage their time better not because they are monitored, but because they respect the mission. They hold high standards not because they fear punishment, but because they care about the impact of their work. Long-term thinking is impossible without meaning. Pressure-driven discipline is inherently short-term because it focuses on immediate compliance. Meaning-driven discipline, however, encourages patience and resilience. It allows individuals and organizations to endure discomfort because they understand what the discomfort serves. This is how trust is built, how cultures are sustained, and how progress becomes sustainable rather than extractive. At a societal level, the erosion of meaning explains why so many people feel disconnected from their work and from one another. We have optimized systems for efficiency while neglecting humanity. We have measured output while ignoring purpose. And as meaning disappears, discipline must be enforced more aggressively, creating a cycle of pressure, resistance, and burnout. Reversing this cycle does not require more rules or stricter enforcement. It requires a return to purpose. When people reconnect with their why, discipline no longer feels like sacrifice, feels like alignment. Effort becomes an expression of values rather than an act of endurance. Time and energy are managed with intention because they are invested, not spent. And in those moments, discipline stops being something we struggle to maintain and becomes something that emerges naturally from caring deeply about what we are building, who we are serving, and why it matters in the first place, not just for today, but for the people who will come after us, who will inherit the systems we design and the cultures we choose to uphold through our daily actions and the standards we quietly reinforce without being asked. Burnout is often treated as a personal shortcoming. We tell people to manage their time better, to build resilience, to practice self-care, as if exhaustion is a flaw in character rather than a signal from the system. This framing is convenient because it shifts responsibility away from leaders, organizations, and cultures, and places it squarely on the individual. But burnout does not happen in a vacuum. It is not the result of laziness or fragility. It is the predictable outcome of systems that demand constant output without offering meaning, trust, or a sense of contribution to something larger. Human beings are not machines designed for endless productivity. We are driven by purpose, connection, and the belief that our effort matters. When those elements are missing, even the most capable and motivated people begin to disengage. Burnout is not caused by working hard. It is caused by working hard for reasons that feel empty or misaligned. People can endure extraordinary workloads when they understand the why behind the work. They break down when effort feels pointless, invisible, or exploitative. Modern organizations often confuse busyness with value. Long hours, constant availability, and relentless urgency are praised as dedication, while reflection and rest are treated as weakness. In these environments, people are rewarded for being reactive rather than thoughtful. There is no time to connect daily tasks to long-term impact, and without that connection, work becomes a never-ending cycle of demands. Over time, the nervous system stays in a state of threat. And what we call burnout is actually the body and mind signaling that the environment is unsustainable. Fear-based leadership accelerates this process. When people are motivated primarily by fear of failure, job loss, or public criticism, they may comply in the short term, but the cost is immense. Fear narrows thinking, reduces empathy, and erodes trust. People stop taking healthy risks and start protecting themselves. They give less of their creativity and more of their energy to survival. Burnout in these systems is not an accident. It is the inevitable consequence of prioritizing results over humanity. Purpose acts as a buffer against exhaustion. When individuals know how their work serves others, when they feel seen and valued, stress becomes more manageable. This does not mean the work is easy. It means the struggle is meaningful. Purpose provides context, and context changes how pressure is experienced. Without purpose, pressure feels oppressive. With purpose, pressure feels like responsibility. The difference is not in the workload, but in the meaning attached to it. Leaders play a decisive role in whether burnout spreads or recedes. Leaders who communicate only what needs to be done without explaining why it matters reduce people to functionaries. Leaders who treat people as replaceable resources send a clear message that human limits are inconveniences. In such cultures, burnout is not only common, it is normalized. People are praised for pushing past their limits until they can no longer function, and then quietly replaced. Purpose-driven leadership interrupts this cycle. It acknowledges that people are not endlessly renewable. It creates environments of trust where asking for help is not punished and rest is not equated with lack of ambition. More importantly, it consistently connects individual roles to collective impact. When people understand how their work improves lives, strengthens communities, or contributes to a meaningful vision, they are more willing to endure difficulty without losing themselves in the process. At a societal level, widespread burnout reflects a deeper crisis of meaning. We have built systems that optimize for speed, scale, and profit while neglecting human well-being. We have taught people to chase success without asking what success is for. As a result, many reach milestones only to feel empty, disconnected, and exhausted. This is not a failure of individual ambition. It is a failure of collective purpose. Addressing burnout, therefore, requires more than wellness programs and motivational slogans. It requires redesigning systems around human needs. It requires leaders to take responsibility for the environments they create. It requires organizations to measure success not only by output, but by sustainability, trust, and long-term impact. When purpose is restored, energy follows. When meaning returns, resilience grows. And when people are allowed to contribute to something that aligns with their values, burnout loses its grip, not because the work disappears, but because the work finally makes sense. And the effort feels like it is building something that matters beyond immediate results and personal survival. Something that justifies the cost of showing up fully day after day. Fear-driven leadership is often mistaken for strength. It looks decisive, urgent, and results-oriented. It relies on pressure, control, and the constant reminder of consequences. In the short term, it can appear effective because fear is a powerful motivator. People move quickly when they are afraid of punishment, loss, or humiliation. Targets are met, deadlines are enforced, and compliance is high. From the outside, it can look like order and efficiency. But what is actually happening beneath the surface is far more damaging. Fear narrows human behavior. When people feel threatened, their instinct is not to think creatively or act courageously, but to protect themselves. They do what is necessary to avoid negative outcomes, not what is best for the organization or the people it serves. Innovation declines because taking risks feels dangerous. Honest communication disappears because speaking up feels unsafe. Over time, fear-driven environments produce silence, conformity, and mediocrity disguised as discipline. The damage of fear-based leadership is cumulative. While short-term results may satisfy immediate demands, the long-term cost is the erosion of trust. Trust is built when people feel safe, respected, and valued. Fear destroys that safety. When leaders rule through intimidation, people stop believing that leadership has their best interests at heart. They begin to see leaders as threats rather than guides. Once trust is broken, every interaction becomes transactional, and relationships are reduced to power dynamics. In fear-driven systems, people focus on appearances rather than reality. Mistakes are hidden instead of addressed. Bad news is delayed or softened. Metrics are manipulated to avoid scrutiny. The organization may appear stable, but it becomes increasingly fragile because it is no longer learning. Fear discourages feedback, and without feedback, improvement is impossible. Over time, small problems grow into systemic failures that no one feels safe enough to confront. Fear also dehumanizes work. When leadership prioritizes results at any cost, people become means to an end. Long hours, constant pressure, and unrealistic expectations are justified as necessary sacrifices. Those who struggle are labeled weak, and those who endure are praised, even as their health and well-being deteriorate. This creates a culture where burnout is normalized and empathy is seen as a liability rather than a strength. Short-term success under fear is deceptive because it relies on unsustainable energy. Fear can push people to sprint, but it cannot sustain a marathon. Eventually, exhaustion sets in. Talented individuals disengage or leave. Those who remain do just enough to survive. The organization becomes dependent on ever-increasing pressure to maintain the same level of output, creating a vicious cycle where fear must constantly escalate to compensate for declining morale and trust. Leadership rooted in fear also shapes behavior beyond the workplace. When people spend their days in environments where control and intimidation are normalized, those behaviors spill into society. It affects how people treat one another, how they raise their children, and how they engage in their communities. Fear-based leadership does not only weaken organizations, it weakens the social fabric by teaching people that power matters more than care, and that compliance is safer than courage. In contrast, leadership grounded in trust and purpose produces resilience. When people feel safe, they are more willing to speak honestly, take responsibility, and support one another. They do not need to be coerced into performing because they understand why their work matters. This does not mean standards are lower or accountability disappears. In fact, accountability is stronger because it is shared rather than imposed. People hold themselves and each other to high standards because they care about the mission and the people around them. The challenge is that trust-based leadership requires patience. It does not always deliver immediate, dramatic results. It invests in people, relationships, and long-term capacity rather than short-term gains. But over time, it creates organizations that are adaptable, innovative, and durable. They are able to navigate uncertainty because they are built on strong human foundations rather than fear and control. Fear-driven leadership may win battles, but it loses wars. It sacrifices long-term health for short-term performance and trades human potential for temporary gains. The true measure of leadership is not how much pressure it can apply, but how much trust it can earn. Because in the long run, organizations and societies do not fail from a lack of discipline or ambition. They fail when fear replaces purpose, when control replaces care, and when leaders choose immediate results over the enduring strength that comes from serving people with integrity, courage, and a commitment to something greater than their own authority. Trust and empathy are often dismissed as soft concepts, nice to have, but secondary to strategy, execution, and performance. In many leadership cultures, they are treated as emotional luxuries rather than serious tools of influence. Yet this misunderstanding has a cost. Trust and empathy are not weaknesses in leadership, they are force multipliers. They determine how well people cooperate under pressure, how openly they communicate, and how resilient they remain in times of uncertainty. Without them, even the most well-designed strategies eventually collapse under the weight of human disengagement. Trust is the foundation of all sustainable systems. It allows people to focus on the work rather than on self-protection. When trust is present, individuals share information freely, admit mistakes early, and collaborate without fear of being exploited. This transparency accelerates learning and reduces waste. In contrast, low-trust environments are slow and expensive. People double-check, withhold information, and protect themselves at the expense of collective progress. The organization may appear busy, but much of that activity is defensive rather than productive. Empathy is what makes trust passable. It is the ability of leaders to understand the experiences, pressures, and motivations of those they lead. Empathy does not mean lowering standards or avoiding difficult conversations. It means recognizing that people are human before they are roles. Leaders who practice empathy listen not only to what is said, but to what is felt. They understand that performance is influenced by context, not just effort, and they respond with curiosity rather than judgment. Sustainable leadership depends on long-term thinking, and long-term thinking requires trust. People are more willing to invest in the future when they believe leadership will act with integrity. They are more willing to endure short-term discomfort when they trust that decisions are made in service of a meaningful vision rather than personal gain. Trust creates patience. It allows leaders to make decisions that may not produce immediate results but strengthen the organization over time. Empathy also plays a critical role in navigating change. Change is inherently stressful because it introduces uncertainty. In environments where empathy is absent, change is experienced as threat. Resistance increases, morale declines, and rumors fill the gaps left by poor communication. Empathetic leaders acknowledge fear rather than dismiss it. They explain the why behind decisions and involve people in the process where possible. This does not eliminate discomfort, but it transforms resistance into engagement. Organizations that lack trust and empathy often rely on fear and control to drive performance. While this may produce short-term compliance, it undermines adaptability. People in fear-based systems avoid risk, suppress dissenting views, and wait for instructions rather than taking initiative. In a rapidly changing world, this rigidity is dangerous. Sustainable leadership requires organizations that can learn, evolve, and respond quickly. And that capability is rooted in psychological safety, which is built through trust and empathy. Trust also strengthens accountability. In high-trust environments, accountability is not imposed, it is shared. People hold themselves to high standards because they feel responsible to one another. They are more likely to give and receive honest feedback because the relationship is based on mutual respect. This creates a culture of continuous improvement rather than blame. Mistakes become opportunities to learn rather than reasons to punish, which ultimately leads to higher performance. At a societal level, the absence of trust and empathy in leadership contributes to division and cynicism. When people believe leaders do not understand them or care about their well-being, they disengage. They stop believing in institutions and in one another. Restoring trust requires leaders to demonstrate empathy consistently, not as a tactic, but as a value. People can sense when empathy is performative and when it is genuine. Sustainable leadership is not about charisma or authority. It is about creating conditions where people can do their best work over the long term. Trust and empathy create those conditions by aligning human needs with organizational goals. They allow leaders to balance performance with well-being and ambition with responsibility. In the end, organizations led with trust and empathy do not just perform better. They last longer, adapt more effectively, and contribute more positively to the people they serve and the communities they influence, proving that the most durable competitive advantage is not found in fear or control, but in the strength of the human relationships leaders choose to build every day. Leadership is often misunderstood as a reward for achievement, rather than a responsibility to serve. Many people pursue leadership for status, authority, or recognition, believing that reaching the top is the ultimate measure of success. But leadership rooted in personal ambition alone is inherently unstable. When leadership is driven primarily by ego, decisions become self-protective, short-term, and disconnected from the people they affect. True leadership begins not with the desire to be important, but with the willingness to be useful in service of something larger than oneself. At its core, leadership is not about being in charge. It is about taking responsibility for the well-being of others and for the integrity of the mission. When leaders define success solely by personal advancement, power, or visibility, they narrow the purpose of the organization to serve the few rather than the many. Over time, this erodes trust. People can sense when leadership exists to elevate itself rather than to advance a shared cause. Engagement fades when individuals feel like tools for someone else's ambition. Service-oriented leadership reverses this dynamic. It asks a fundamentally different question: who do we serve, and why does this work matter beyond our own gain? Leaders who are committed to a cause greater than personal success make decisions through a wider lens. They consider long-term impact, human cost, and ethical consequences. They understand that their role is not to extract value from people, but to create conditions where people can contribute their best selves in pursuit of a meaningful goal. This kind of leadership requires humility. It requires the recognition that no leader succeeds alone, and that authority is borrowed from the trust of those who follow. Humility allows leaders to listen, to admit mistakes, and to learn. It creates space for others to lead from where they are, strengthening the system rather than centralizing power. In contrast, ego-driven leadership clings to control, mistaking dominance for competence, and in doing so, limits the potential of everyone involved. When leadership is anchored in service, discipline, performance, and accountability take on a different character. People do not comply out of fear or obligation. They commit because they believe in the mission and trust the intent of those guiding it. They are more willing to endure hardship, to push through uncertainty, and to hold themselves to high standards because the work feels meaningful. Service transforms effort from a transaction into a contribution. Organizations led in service to a greater cause are also more resilient. They can weather setbacks because their identity is not tied to individual leaders or short-term wins. The purpose remains steady even as strategies evolve. People stay engaged, not because conditions are always comfortable, but because they feel part of something that matters. This stability is impossible in systems where leadership is centered on personal success, as those systems fracture when individual goals conflict with collective needs. At a societal level, leadership without service creates deep fractures. When people observe leaders prioritizing personal gain over public good, cynicism grows. Trust in institutions declines. Cooperation weakens. Service-oriented leadership, however, reinforces the social contract. It signals that leadership is a responsibility carried on behalf of others, not a privilege to be exploited. This restores faith and encourages participation, reminding people that progress is a shared endeavor. Service does not mean self-sacrifice to the point of depletion. It means aligning personal success with the success of the cause and the people served. Leaders can thrive, grow, and be recognized while still anchoring their decisions in something larger than themselves. The difference lies in intent. Personal success becomes a byproduct of meaningful impact rather than the primary objective. Leadership that serves a greater cause demands courage. It requires resisting the temptation of short-term applause and choosing actions that may be unpopular but necessary. It requires standing for values even when doing so carries risk. But it is this courage that builds legacies worth inheriting. Titles fade, metrics change, and recognition passes, but the cultures leaders create and the people they uplift endure. In the end, leadership finds its true measure, not in what it accumulates, but in what it gives, not in how high it rises, but in how many others it lifts, and not in the success it claims for itself, but in the strength, dignity, and purpose it leaves behind in service of a cause that will continue long after any single leader steps aside. All of this leads us to a simple but demanding truth. The future does not belong to the most aggressive, the most disciplined, or the most powerful. It belongs to those who choose meaning over momentum and service over self-interest. Burnout, fear, disengagement, and division are not personal failures. They are signals that we have drifted from our why. And the responsibility to correct that drift does not sit with systems alone. It sits with each of us in how we lead, how we follow, how we build, and how we show up for others. So the challenge is clear. Choose to lead with purpose, even when pressure tempts you to cut corners. Choose trust when fear feels faster. Choose empathy when control feels safer. Commit to building work, organizations, and communities that serve people rather than consume them. Think long-term in a world addicted to short-term wins. Act together rather than alone. Because when leadership becomes service to something greater than personal success, discipline becomes natural, trust becomes durable, and progress finally becomes human, sustainable, and worthy of the people who will carry it forward long after we are gone.